Yeah, so good. So you did it correctly, nicely done. Good job with the recording. So good. So yeah, so it's been interesting kind of group that thank you for allowing me to be part of it, and that it's been interesting kind of hear from parents, and I'm a school psychologist. I'm a professor at the College of St. Rose School of Psychology. I worked as a school psychologist for many years prior to being a professor. I never ever thought I would ever be a professor. Definitely was not in my yearbook at all that this guy would be a professor. That was not part of the process. But I work, I do consulting with districts all across the country around how to do assessment, especially around learning disabilities, reading disabilities, and now more dyslexia, and getting into how to do evaluations with multilingual children around dyslexia. So those are the main things. And one of the things I've noticed when kind of being part of the meetings has been that people always talk about, well, I need to get my kid assessed. I need to get some type of assessment kind of done for the kid to be to get the service, I guess. But it's a very weird thing, especially as a school psychologist, when people would come to me and say that you have to test this kid. I go, why? And they say, well, he has difficulty reading. I go, okay, what do you want me to do? Test him to see if his difficulty reading. I go, you you just told me. I believe you. So what's my test going to show? And so some people, and I love doing assessment, but I think it's overused and it's also misunderstood. And that's I think especially it's a one way of I, I'm brutal in IEP meetings because I make sure that people are talking with the parents, not to the parent, that everyone's involved as a team and using language that's appropriate for all the parents to understand what the heck is going on. That the end game is not to get the kid double the amount of time to read. The end game has to be actually teaching the kid how to read. But that generally does not happen at IEP meetings. And they just rattle off these scores that mean nothing to nobody, including all the educators, generally, that no one's really sure what the heck is going on. So, uh, so I'm going to try to do it within maybe about a half hour. God help me. And hit some of the high notes, and then I'm always available for folks to contact me. And if anyone wants me to do an extension of something or talk about something, I'm always happy to. So I'm glad it's being recorded, so we would kind of get a general sense of things, of what we're kind of going for here. So, and I'll be very mindful of time. So it's about 8:10. So I'll keep checking in with people, and just cut me off where people can ask questions. It's fine. Doesn't have to happen. And we'll go from there. So uh, I presume everyone can see it says the weird language of education and assessment. Yes.
Looks great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Look at that. Yeah, I made your decoding dyslexia thing. Look at that. Look at a big target. I don't know what's going on there. So that was fun. So, and then there's my email address, and people are always welcome to contact me. And people do. It's great. Makes me feel like I have friends. So it's very nice. So it's always good. So let me go here. Just as quick, if you didn't see in the New York Times this past Sunday, there was a big article about what parents are doing and groups like yourself and trying to get districts to do the right thing by their kids. And so it's just great to be part of it and trying to get more people involved. Just know about St. Rose that if you know anyone who wants to be a teacher, they're offering anyone who wants to come in, they're offering free rooms for 4 years. So $28,000. If you're a person who's changing your career into teaching, they'll give you $1,500 per year for, I think, 5 semesters or something like that. So they're really trying to increase the amount of teachers that we have. But ultimately, the goal of this 35 minutes, 35 minutes, is just to make things saner, not sane. Nothing could be sane in schools. You have too many little kids running around. There's nothing sane about that whatsoever. But how can we have better communication? How can we better collaborate, especially as parents, to understand it so they can better advocate for their child within at those meetings. That just to quickly hit the high note, just so we're on the same page in terms of language, that for me, I look at terms of the simple view of reading to understand reading, in terms of decoding, you have to be able to read the words, then you have to understand the words in order to comprehend what the heck you're reading. And as a school psychologist, I have a lot of people come to me and say, not only can he not read words, but he can't understand the words he can't read. I go, I hope so. And so it's just fascinating when people say that all the time. Or now with my multilingual children, who they're like, yeah, he doesn't understand English, and you want to believe he can't understand the text. I go, yes, that's what should be happening. So it's very strange. And then when it comes to dyslexia, that ultimately it's those kids who have difficulty reading words, but they have great language skills, language comprehension. They can't read the words, or they read really slow because they don't have immediate access to those words. And so, but if they did have access to those words, they would understand it. So if they can't read the word cat, but they know exactly what a cat is, once they're able to read cat, they would understand what cat is, and they would be able to comprehend. That's a big issue, especially in terms of high schools, where way too many kids are getting reading comprehension interventions rather than teaching the kids how to read the words in the first place. So it's a real issue at the middle school, high school level, where they're focused too much on one thing rather than the basic skills that that kid needs. And ultimately, what I find in a lot of districts is that the kids with dyslexia, the kids with the mixed reading disorder, and the kids with the language all get the same thing, even though they need different things. So we have to distinguish the differences between all this to do a better job and use our resources more wisely. That ultimately, special ed is not extra help, but that's the way it's generally used. That those IEP meetings generally have been, well, it's the only way to get him into special ed so he gets extra help. Well, that's not what it's supposed to be for. It's supposed to be working with the kid in a more specified manner to teach that kid reading, writing, math, or behaviors or whatnot. But unfortunately, right now it's being used as extra help, where it's just special ed and general ed, and that's not really going well, because ultimately we have to make the intervention special, not this weird place called special ed. That doesn't make any sense. And that we should be having a really good multi-tier system support system, or RTI, going on within schools. That tier 1, which is this bottom here, is what's the most important tier, which is that what are we teaching in the regular ed classroom for all kids all the time, including those kids who might be dyslexic. Those kids who might be dyslexic, who can't access to words, need to hear words and language that's at the 3rd or 4th or 5th grade level. So when they actually get access to the text, they could read that, understand what the heck they're reading. They shouldn't be outside the room. So when you have a kid who has difficulty with reading, they need more reading, not less reading. So they should get tier 1, a good chunk of tier 1, and then maybe tier 2 or tier 3 type of intervention from there. But ultimately, what happens, what I hear a lot in this group, is that people just say that, well, I need the kid to be assessed. Well, first, for me as a school psychologist, I have to make sure they were taught how to read first. If they were not taught how to read, if I test them in their reading, guess how they're going to perform? Badly. And then people will say that it's the kid who's being identified with a reading disability rather than what the school did and the system did. That's a problem, because when I identify a kid with a learning disability, I'm saying that kid has a neurological issue. That should be difficult. That should be hard. But schools and others kind of want that kid to be identified in order for them to get extra help. That's not what I'm there for. I'm there to kind of teach teachers how to do the right interventions by these kids, to understand how to teach math, how to teach reading, how to teach writing, before I do any of this type of assessment. But I know the realities of the school is that people have to go through this weird assessment thing in order for sometimes these kids to be identified with a learning disability, for them to get the modifications and accommodations they may need. So I understand the realities of that. But ultimately, if we did a good job of MTSS, that we would recognize, even before we did these weird WISC or Woodcock Johnson or WIAT, Wyatt, or whatever, Gort, Told, all these weird tests, right? If my kid had difficulty with comprehension, I would look at their fluency. If they had difficulty with fluency, I would look at their word recognition. If they had poor word recognition, I would look at their phonics. If they had poor phonics, I would look at their phonemic awareness. And I could do all that with like 1-minute measures. So when people talk about assessment, I could do all this real quick and see what's going on with the kid before I do my crazy normative assessment, which, and by the way, I love testing. I can't get enough of tests. Oh my God, they're super awesome. But I want to stop it and do the less, because I find that they are invasive. That what I'm going to be doing is doing testing, like say for their working memory, which means, and they're bad at that. That means I do multiple measures of that, which doesn't make them feel so hot. So that's not nice. So I want to make sure they were taught reading or writing or math first before I do my invasive test. That if I say I have a head pain and the doctor says, well, either it's a headache or a tumor, so let's just cut you open and see what happens, that's not good. We have to kind of think about what we want to do first and do the least invasive first before I go do something invasive like normative assessment that lots of people seem to want for. So when I do some of these measures, these 1-minute measures, I could see if a kid's doing better or not. So if I look, blue's going up, red is going straight. Blue up, good, red straight, bad. This is the data I want to kind of collect before I do any assessment. If I have a kid who is blue, there's no reason for me to do my normative assessment. If I have red for many weeks on end, then I may want to do my assessment to kind of figure out why that intervention is not working. So I just want to give that as a preamble before we start to think about doing any normative assessment, that we have to kind of work with teachers and educators to know what assessments they could do within their class, but also to know what an intervention is. And an intervention is teaching a skill, building fluency in a skill, or encouraging application of a skill. And so it's teaching a specific skill, not doing homework, not highlighting, not moving a kid closer to the board, not giving them more eye contact. Those are not interventions that often come out off as interventions. An intervention is teaching a specific skill, teaching phonemic awareness, teaching phonics, teaching vocabulary. It is not ESL, which stands for me, English slower and louder. It is not that, but oftentimes that's what it is. I'm just going to review what you did in class. That's not what it should be. You should be teaching them a more specific skill. Whatever happened in class, happened in class. And that's what should happen there, because a service, a resource room, and AIS are not interventions. People will say that, well, he got AIS. Then you say, what happened in AIS? Nobody knows. Well, that means nobody knows what the intervention was. So it's really to make sure in those meetings, if someone says, well, he'll get AIS, the next question has to be, what's going to happen? The same thing for resource room, or the same thing for getting speech language pathology. That is not an intervention. What happens is the intervention. So parents really need to be asking, which skills are lacking for my kid making progress? How's the skill deficit being addressed? Is my child being given enough time to see a difference? And are all the components being done with fidelity? And that's another conversation for another day for those things. So let me get to the normative stuff. And that's what I do as a school psychologist. I'll do my testing, and they'll talk about this IQ kind of thing that nobody knows what the hell that is. They just talk about IQ, whatever it might be. And that's what I'm looking at, this overall G. Okay. So this G I'm saying is IQ because G matters, but there are a whole bunch of ways I can measure G or this IQ. It's the ingredients that go into the IQ that matter more than the overall IQ. That all kids who may have an IQ here, there are strengths and weaknesses. Does that make sense? All kids who have an IQ that may be here, they're not all the same. And the same thing for kids who may have an IQ down here, they're not all the same. So I look at the ingredients that make up G that matter. But they change the nature of G or the IQ. So that, for example, if we had a brownie baking contest, legal ones, right? There'll be, some people will make it with milk chocolate. Some people make it with dark chocolate. Someone ruins it with walnuts, right? But at the end of the day, they're all walnuts, but the taste of that is going to be different. Much like the difference of the IQ performance will be different based on the ingredients that go in. And so what some people have done in the past, they look at the overall IQ and they look at a reading performance. They see this is average and this is average, so this kid is fine. And they'll see this kid who has a low IQ and a low reading performance, and they'll say this kid is doing what they should be doing because they have a low IQ. But see how their reading performance is really low? So this kid does not get identified with a learning disability, not until about 6th grade, when the kid has failed a whole bunch of times, when we should have given them an intervention way, way before. And so that's like putting a net up after a person falls off a high wire. So that makes no sense. But I'll have a kid who has an IQ in the average range or a G in the average range, and their reading is low, and they'll say, this kid is learning disabled. But if you look at the reading performance, it's here, and look at this kid. Whoops, sorry about that. Let me go back here. Oops, let me go back. Previous. So this kid does not get identified, but this kid does. And what's worse in my mind, sometimes this kid gets identified. They call this kid gifted LD, learning disabled, and that's not true. This kid's reading performance is average. They are part of the herd. They just not as mutant as these abilities. This kid is reading okay. This is not a disability. But sometimes this kid gets resources. This kid gets resources, but this kid does not. It's a real problem sometimes within schools. So that when we start looking at those kids, so this is ultimately, it should say that this is, you're part of the herd. This is congratulations. And down here is like, oh boy, we need to do something. Those should be the classifications. And so what we'll do is that this G, we'll start to break up this G into its ingredients. And I'll talk about these in a moment. These are the ingredients that make up this overall IQ. But do you see how these are low? And see how reading is low? That these are average. Does that make sense? Just give me a head nod. These are average. These are good, right? These are not so good. This includes phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness, able to hear sounds, understand those sounds, move those sounds around, phonemic awareness. Do you think phonemic awareness might be important to reading in the initial stages? Absolutely. So if you're bad at that, how is your reading going to be? That's going to be low. If I included phonemic awareness in the overall IQ and the phonemic awareness was bad, would the IQ go up or would the IQ go down? The IQ would go down. So now the IQ here, this G is low. And see how remember I said the reading is low, the G is low? And they'll say that kid is not disabled. When it really is the phonemic awareness that's impacting the overall G and the reading. So there's lots of mistakes in identifying a disability. But also I know they have some strengths that could also help them with the reading. So I no longer identify a learning disability. I identify a phonemic awareness issue that's impairing a kid's reading skills, to be much more specific about the identification. And so I'll talk about these abilities in a second here. So this is called a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in terms of identifying a learning disability. A pattern of strengths up here, weaknesses down here, and they're consistent with the weak academic area. Okay. So this is your brain on drugs. Now, this is all the different abilities that, and I don't look at all these abilities because my number one rule is no killing children, for God's sake. So I don't measure all this. But here is that overall G up top, and here are all the main ingredients. This is like the main categories, and these are the subcategories. So if I look here in the middle, this thing called working memory, be able to juggle lots of information all at once. Then I have these narrow abilities or subcategories right underneath it. And that here's fluid reasoning. Okay? This is your novel problem solving, and here are some narrow abilities underneath it. For me to measure any one broad ability, which are the main categories, I have to look at two qualitatively different narrow abilities or subcategories. If I did two measures of whatever the hell this is, induction, don't worry about what it is. If I did two measures of induction, the only thing I measured was induction. If I did a measure of induction and this other thing, this general sequential reasoning, and they were both average, then the overall reasoning would be average. Hope that makes sense. That if I looked at, so let's say I did a measure of induction, I did a measure of general sequential reasoning, they're both average. Is there any reason for me to do any other testing in this area? Because if I did another test, it's going to be average. But what happens in a lot of assessment, they over-test. They test the bejesus out of like working memory. Rather than saying enough's enough, why do we have, so if I had this is really low and this was really low, I know their reasoning is low. So I'll stop measuring that area because what am I trying to get at? And there are other issues to it, and there's more nuance to that. So I'll just tell you real quickly what these things are and give you a better sense of things. You have this one thing over here called comprehension knowledge, or your crystallized knowledge. So it's your background knowledge, your vocabulary, your understanding of the world around you, your understanding of language, your syntax, semantics. Might that be important in reading? Your vocabulary and all those things. Good God, yes. But this is not a processing area. This is just, if I read more, my vocabulary is better. But these people who have really lots of good GC, crystallized knowledge, background knowledge, are the people on Jeopardy. Right? They have way too much GC background knowledge. Okay, everything is crystallized. I have Lady Gaga songs that are crystallized. I want them out, but they've been crystallized. They're in there somewhere. So those folks who have really broad vocabulary have a better sense and a better comprehension skills. Another area real quick, fluid reasoning is novel problem solving. So for those who learn about Sudoku, did everyone do Sudoku at some point? Or any of those little types of puzzle games? That's fluid reasoning when you first learn about it. So you have induction and deduction are the main ones there. So induction, why things are a set. The Venn diagram, people remember the trauma, the Venn diagram? That's inductive reasoning. One of these things is not like the other. So that is why things are a set. Deductive reasoning is if-then statements. If all apples are fruits and all fruits grow on trees, then apples have to grow on trees. So that's deductive reasoning. Do those two things sound a little different than in one another? One's why things are a set, the other one's if-then. They both may impact things, but one may impact things more than another one. So that when a kid is reading, they have to make things a set. Why is this? Why is this? Why is this? But they also have to do if-thens. If this happened, then I predict this was going to happen. So all that's an important part of reading. Working memory is juggling lots of information all at once. So within a moment, within about 3 to 5 seconds. So those kids who may have to write, they have to remember how things are spelled, what their idea is, what the paragraph they want to write, all at the same time while they're trying to write. And it's brutal if you have bad working memory. And the same thing for reading. Learning efficiency is getting things in or being able to put things in the file cabinet. If you think of your background knowledge as GC as your file cabinet, GL or learning efficiency is getting stuff in there. So when I listen to a lecture, I can remember things from it. I'm getting things in my file cabinet. Or another way of looking at it is this thing called associative memory, which includes understanding a sound to a weird squiggle, which is a letter. So I'm able to associate the k sound with the letter C. Does that make sense? Learning efficiency. How quickly can you do that? Then you also have this thing called retrieval fluency. How quick can you get it out of your file cabinet? So when people on Jeopardy, do they all have big file cabinets? Yes. Who gets to answer the question? The person who retrieves it the quickest, who hits the button the fastest. That's retrieval fluency. So retrieval fluency is really important in reading because I need to recognize each word immediately, sight word vocabulary. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. I'm able to recognize those words with immediacy. That's my retrieval fluency. So that'll be something of, if I'm bad at that, then I'm reading Jack and Jill went up the hill. That's no good. So does that make sense? So you have learning efficiency, retrieval fluency, and then you have these weird things called visual spatial reasoning and auditory processing. Auditory processing is phonemic awareness, and visual spatial reasoning is the ability to kind of break apart or put together weird designs like a jigsaw puzzle. This visual spatial reasoning has very little to do with reading, writing, or math, outside of maybe orthography, but generally has nothing to do with reading, writing, or math. Yeah. So I'm just giving a general sense, which brings me to, we have to stop teachers saying that people are a visual learner or auditory learner. That's not true. So this is a great video to watch to make sure to help out teachers to know that's not true. Okay? So it's just not true, but I still get it all the time. That if I look at the WISC, just because that seems to be a measurement that most people use along the way in schools, the WISC does a decent job of looking at your novel problem solving, the inductive and deductive reasoning, Venn diagram, if-then statement. It has a measure of inductive and a measure of deductive. Remember, I said you had to do 2 measures to get 1 broad. Does that make sense? So that it does a good job of measuring this overall thing called fluid reasoning. It does okay in your background knowledge, but not so much in terms of your working memory or your processing speed. Processing speed is the ability to do simple tasks under time pressure. Very simple. So if I give you a bunch of word cards and I ask you to alphabetize them, you could do it. But if you have to do that really quick, the cards go everywhere. Or do people remember the game Perfection? and you had to put all the things in real quick, like the worst possible game to give to a kid, because a spring-loaded sharp object thing, right? That makes no sense. But that's processing speed. So some kids have difficulty with that, which messes up with their reading and whatnot. But if I start looking deeper into, so these are the 7 subtests that make up this overall G, but there are really 10 subtests that you should give to get a better sense of all those abilities I talked about. So sometimes I'll give 10 subtests, but only 7 make up the overall IQ. So you have to be aware of the differences there, but I like doing all 10 because it gives me a better sense of these different broad abilities. There's one broad ability called VCI that I'm sure people have heard about. It's called Verbal Comprehension Index. It has nothing to do with verbal comprehension. It's all about oral expression, which is language. So people, your school psychs or others will say his verbal comprehension was really good. It had nothing to do with verbal comprehension, because what you do in verbal comprehension is you say, tell me what this word means. That means the kid has to express what the word means. Another thing I say is like, tell me how these two things are alike. They have to tell me how things are alike. They have to use their expressive language. But when I say verbal comprehension, that sounds like receptive language. It's a real important difference to understand what's going on with the kid, to know how we're looking at what may be amiss with the kid, because it might be a speech language issue that we're looking at. So just to kind of get to numbers real quick, and then I'm doing okay. So about 5 more minutes. Am I okay, Tina? Good. Think about my time. So good. So
Sure.
Good. So 90 to 109, just give you some numbers, generally should be the average range. But you see some folks will say 85 to 115. That's a bad range to make average range. It is statistically correct, but no person that I know, if I said, if someone has an 85, another person has a 114, to say they belong in the same group, nobody ever says they belong in the same group. 90 to 109, remember that curve I showed you? 90 to 109 would be the average range. That's 50% of the population. 25% low is below that. Another 25% is above that. So if you're within or above the normal limits, congratulations, everything's okay. If you're below the normal limits, I'm worried about you. And the same thing, I could talk about scaled scores, 8 to 12 would be average, but some people just focus on the numbers. What I'm going to talk about in a moment is not about the numbers matter, but performance matters more. How did they get there? Just because you perform in the average range doesn't mean that things are going well. And just because you perform below the normal limits doesn't mean that things are bad. So it's really understanding what happened, that one number doesn't equal another number equals another number. So if you have a report and you get an 85 on something, that 85 may actually be a decent performance if I really look at it. Whereas another 85 might be a really bad performance by knowing what happened. I'll give you a quick example. I'll have a kid in vocabulary, I'll say, what does a dog mean? And I'll get one kid go, that's a great question. And they're like, oh, I got one of those. It goes arf, arf, and it's a pet. And you're like, okay, you get full credit, 2 points. I'll get another kid who says, oh, a dog. Thank you very much for the question. There are 1,500 breeds of dog. I will now name all 1,500, and they all evolve from Lupus the wolf. And they start going on about everything about that. That kid gets 2 points, full credit. Do those 2 points sound equal in any way whatsoever? But what we do is we say, well, he got a 12 on that. That 12 does not tell me what actually happened. So don't ask for numbers, I want to know what happened. Why did the kid perform in the average range? Why did the kid perform below there? What could or could not the kid do? That's the more important question. Don't tell me the number, because the number is not going to help me out at all. Numbers matter, performance matters more. So performance is greater than the score. So tell me what my kid could do, not what this number was, because that number doesn't mean anything to anybody. Okay. So just other quick things about numbers. If someone reports grade equivalent, it's incorrect. Grade equivalent does not mean that kid is reading at that grade level. That is not what it means. It means they have the same raw score or number they get correct is the average of what somebody in that grade gets correct. it doesn't mean that they have the same ability. So if I'm in 8th grade and I have a 3rd grade equivalent, it means that I have the same raw score, but as an 8th grader, have I had more print experience than a 3rd grader? So yes, so that it is not what it means. And in fact, if I use a confidence interval, meaning the low and high end of things, which is their true ability somewhere in there, that if I have a kid who has a grade equivalent of a 10th grade, if I look at their 95% confidence, I have 95% confidence their true ability is somewhere in here. It would be from like the 6th to the 14th grade. So anytime someone reports grade equivalent, I report the confidence interval and see if they like that. Nobody does, because that's insane. Okay, and I'll show you another quick little thing. So here's the raw score that I convert to a standard score. 100 is dead on average. That's dead on average. That's bing, you're at the 50th percentile. Here's the grade equivalent. If a kid gets one more question right, here's their standard score, which is just a touch over 100. Here's their grade equivalent. So because the kid got one thing more right, suddenly they went up 2.5 grades. It's incorrect. And there's a whole host of like stats around that I'm not going to get into, but that's the nonsense that goes on. Okay, so don't do grade equivalent. Okay. So good. So let's go through the steps. I just use this because I'm a downstate New York and I like watching people fall down steps. So I'll get there real quick. Okay. That here are the reasons. This is, I need to pick out my assessments based on the reason for referral. If the kid has a reading issue, remember I talked about fluid reasoning, background knowledge, working memory, all those kind of things? That if a kid has a reading issue, I want to look at, see the I and the RG, those are those subcategories. That I know because it's a reading issue that these have impact on the overall reading. Does that follow? So that based on what the reason for referral, but what goes on in school is they say, oh, the kid has been referred, I'm just going to do this test. So rather than say, why am I doing the test in the first place? So I want to do the least for the most. So the same thing, if you went to the doctor's office, they said, well, we could figure out what's going on with you with either 10 needles or 5 needles. Depending on your personality, you'll go for the 5 needles. So that's what this helps me out to know exactly what I need to measure and not worry about IQ. What I care about are those different categories that impact learning. Look at math achievement, for example. There is no need to do phonemic awareness if the kid has a math issue. It doesn't mean anything. So I don't measure that. Okay? And I look at what my tests measure. And so if I look at, let's say here is, well, I'll go here for a second. Look at the WISC, which most people have had measures with. It looks at fluid reasoning. See the check mark with fluid reasoning? It has background knowledge, your vocabulary. It may have working memory, ability to juggle lots of information, but it doesn't have phonemic awareness. Is phonemic awareness an important part to reading? Yes. And guess what we use most often to identify reading disability? The WISC. That doesn't have phonemic awareness. How is that possible to use that? So what I do is I actually like the WISC. I will supplement the WISC with another measure that measures phonemic awareness. Does that make sense? But if I just use the WISC alone, I'm not doing a good job to get a sense of all the different abilities that may be impacting reading. Okay. So that, just another quick little numbers thing here, and I'm hoping that this is helpful, that what some people will see, and because I understand, because you see these numbers, and if a kid is a low number, you freak out. So here is a kid, here's one area where a kid does well on one subtest and really bad on another subtest. And what I find in a lot of meetings, people just focus on this subtest number 2. And it's like, what happened here? What happened here? And between these two subtests, let's say they both measure fluid reasoning, they make up this overall composite. So you have this one subtest that did really well, this one that didn't do so well. Here's the overall composite. If I reported just the composite, see how it's average? Does that make sense? That's average, this overall composite. It's almost the average of these two things. So the kid's performing where they should. Do you think that this is a good representation of these two performances? It's hiding something. So I need to do one more measure. Let's say that this was, remember I talked about inductive and deductive? Let's say this was inductive and this was deductive reasoning. So here we have inductive, this is deductive. I'm going to do another measure of deductive reasoning because that's the bad performance, to see if that's really bad. I do another measure of deductive reasoning and I see it's here. See how this test is over here now? If I just look at these two, I'm pretty sure that their reasoning skills is pretty good, that this is an outlier. I'm not so worried about this. But I always need confirmatory data and not freak out because one number is low. Or I also don't want my school psychologist or others to say that this kid performed in the average range, so everything is okay. That would be inappropriate. So I need to know what those numbers are. So I'm trying to do stats without numbers, by the way. So, but hopefully that makes sense, that don't always worry that a number is low. We have to understand what they all make up in so many ways. And did they find confirmatory data one way or the other? If this was moved over here, then I would say that this is an area of weakness. And I have confirmation around it. One subtest does not make a disability, or one composite does not make a disability. Okay? So ultimately what I do is I try to do a more neurocognitive evaluation to identify that the kid's phonemic awareness is what's impacting their reading, but they have all these other strengths. So I'll look at we have one discrepancy, we have a consistency here, a consistency of phonemic awareness that goes with reading, but they have these strengths that should also be impactful in reading. So it's really asking the folks of like, what's going on? What were the evaluations with things? So here is, if I look at numbers, here are my cognitive strengths. This is called facilitating. Facilitating means helping, right? So remember all these areas that are facilitating or helping? I create a composite. And if I look at here is my weakness, here's my cognitive weakness, and here's the reading performance. So remember how reading is low? So I have a discrepancy here, but this cognitive weakness is consistent with the academic weakness. Does that make sense? That's what I would be talking about in the meeting, that he's really good here. He has these skills, these skills, these skills. Where he's weak is phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness makes reading bad. So it's phonemic awareness that's impacting his reading, but he does have these strengths to assist him with school. That's not learning styles. That's just way of kind of thinking about how to identify learning disability, rather than this number versus this number and nobody knows what you're talking about. But now I've identified the neurological issue that's impacting learning in that academic area. Okay? So that I could have, again, these different abilities to figure things out. So remember, this is phonemic awareness, right? If I did the whisk, remember how phonemic awareness is pulling down G? Remember I talked about that, it's pulling down the overall IQ? If I just did the whisk, this would be gone, this would not appear, and this would not be anything. So does anyone know why this overall IQ is low? We wouldn't, because we don't have these things. Does that make sense? So that's why I would want to include other quick little tests to tap into this to better understand why this kid might be performing so poorly in the area of reading, if the kid was taught how to read. If the kid was not taught how to read, wouldn't the reading be this low? That no matter, even if I found a processing deficit and his reading is low, but if I knew he wasn't taught reading, I should not identify with a reading disability because the kid wasn't taught reading in the first place. These have nothing to do with that. Does that make sense? So I'll just kind of, then I have different recommendations. So Parker Phonics is a great website to go to. There's free books to learn about how to teach reading and about the simple view of reading. 5 from 5 has lots of free materials. Again, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to see this. So I'm just kind of zooming through quick. Texas is doing better than New York. Darn them, right? They have all this material, all free stuff about how to teach vocabulary to middle school students and upper elementary students. All free stuff. This is also from Tennessee, excuse me, that has whole bunch of different modules, teacher guides, and how to teach reading, all different units, all free. Go give this to your teacher. All free. Anytime a district says we don't have any resources, I'm like, let me introduce you to the internet. For those who are scared of math, the Science of Math, this is a great website to go to. The Science of Reading podcast is awesome. 95 Live has lots of free stuff, lots of great stuff to kind of go through. The Writing Revolution is a great book in terms of writing. More math stuff here. And I'll stop there. How about that? If that makes sense. Good.
Whew.
Because I was
That makes
talking
sense.
about a half hour, but does that make a little bit more sense about like just some of the assessments that are coming at you? Yes, no, or and you could ask questions around it. Just, you know, it's just trying to, because usually they just say he had an IQ here, achievements down here. They just kind of talk over you and say, therefore he's learning disabled. They'll say he has really good IQ, a really bad reading performance. And they'll say, that's why he's learning disabled. And you say, well, why can't he read? And they're like, well, he's smart, but he can't read. Like, no, what is the issue that's impacting this kid in reading? And they'll show you the dopey curve and say, see, his reading is up here and his reading is down here. Therefore, he's learning disabled. So we're going to give him extra time on test. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. But no one actually talks about what intervention they're supposed to do. I believe that's usually what happens in the meetings. And they'll say they'll just give him double the amount of time to read a book he can't read in a separate location that I still don't know where that separate location is, by the way. And it seems like it'd be a mysterious place. And every time I hear from the kids, they're like, I'm there for like 15 minutes. Meanwhile, they had 2 hours. So they just kind of say these accommodations, or they'll say that they're in special ed, so they'll get more help. But no one explains what the help is. So I'm going beyond all of that for this moment because I understand that people have to be tested, but the tests aren't really helping with what specifically are they supposed to be doing there. So I'll stop there for see if you have any quick questions. And I know there's only so few people, so.
Can I just ask you to
Yeah.
go over the difference between full scale IQ and the general ability index? Because sometimes I have both of those in the report.
Yeah. So what Maria's asking is that sometimes you look at that overall G, and remember the ingredients that go into IQ are these 7 subtests. And they look at things like background knowledge, your reasoning skills, your working memory, your ability to work under time pressure, and your visual spatial skills. The GAI, or the GAI, excuse me, General Ability Index, it only includes your reasoning skills and your background knowledge, your vocabulary. Those are the king and queen of cognitive areas. In essence, what 2 things do I really want? I want to have a good vocabulary, good language, good understanding of the world, and I want to be able to reason with that world. Versus the ability to do simple tasks under time pressure. What would you prefer? I would prefer to have good vocabulary, good language skills, rather than be able to kind of put word cards quickly together. But the lack of ability to do working memory, or my lack of be able to do things under time pressure, could make it look like I don't have good knowledge, I don't have good reasoning skills. That would not be true. It's those things that's impacting those. And then I actually get frustrated as a kid because then I feel stupid, even because I actually understand the world around me, but I can't work that fast. Does that make sense? So the GAI includes the fluid reasoning and the background knowledge. The CPI, the Cognitive Processing Index, the CPI, the Cognitive Processing Index, includes working memory and processing speed. Does that make sense? So I'll compare the GAI with the CPI. The GAI, general ability, fluid reasoning, background knowledge. CPI, working memory, processing speed. I'll compare those 2 composites. see if there's a big difference between those two. And if there is, then I'm concerned because I really think that kid has a processing deficit that's impairing their ability to kind of do well in the classroom. So the same thing, Tina talked earlier to that she had the Woodcock-Johnson done. They had the same thing in the Woodcock-Johnson. There are different types of composites that look at, it's called GFGC versus a learning efficiency composite. And I could compare those composites to kind of see that, okay, so they understand the world around them, they have good language skills, but these things are impairing their access to what they want to do. So I don't think necessarily that happens at IEP meetings where they actually explain some of that stuff. I don't believe they do. Generally, they just say, look at all these numbers and away we go. Right? Let's just get to, that we're going to give them extra time on test. So I'm being overly critical of some, but they just don't know what to do. And they're not sure how to interpret any of the information. That follows. Does that make sense, Maria? Just like the difference between the two? Have they given you those things or?
They have, and they weren't able to explain the difference. They're like, well, this is more of the true ability that we're looking at.
That's not true. Oh, you're right.
Doesn't make sense. So I appreciate.
Did that make sense how I explained it, or?
It does, yes. And it makes sense in terms of who he is as a learner, knowing what I know about scores, that is, more reflective in that way. Right. Is there, sorry, just one other thing. You had mentioned you give the different subtests, like in the broad range to find out what the broad would be. And I know sometimes schools will use certain tests a certain way to not show the true deficits. Is there, if we have a concern specifically for our child, is there a way for us to ask the practitioner to assess specific subtests?
Yeah, that it would be the tests are the tests, all the subtests, they're not biased. It's the bias comes from the interpretation of those measures. And I say that in terms of the same thing that you're talking about, that it's really hard to give a cognitive measure. I'm just talking about cognition for the moment. That's going to hide anything. If it measures that narrow ability, it'll do a decent job of measuring that narrow ability. Now, if you want confirmatory, you want some confirmation about something, you could ask for another measure to be given to see if that kid's reasoning skills or working memory really is an area of weakness or a strength. But also to your point, sometimes things are hidden behind large composite scores. That's missing some of those low scores that made up that overall composite. Would that make sense? That there's a measure, like there's something like I remember on the TOLD, it's a speech language measure. There are 3 subtests that look at one type of working memory, which is just being able to repeat back exactly what you said, and has one subtest that looks at the ability to juggle lots of information. For me, juggling information is much more important than just being able to repeat back what I said. Some kids will get like high scores on those 3 and a low score on the juggling one. The overall composite looks good, but it's hiding that low performance. But remember what I said, like just because I have one high performance, one low performance, panic or anything like that. You have to know if this measures something different than this. And what specifically does this measure versus this? Would that make sense?
Question about that?
Yeah, please.
So it was specifically like a speech thing, but it was exactly what you're saying, where his overall was fine.
Yeah.
His speech articulation is fine. And overall he did well, but he had some very low because of his language issue, which speech can help.
Yeah.
But they told me, well, overall he's in the average range, so he's even though it was recommended for him to receive speech therapy, and I'm doing it outside of school, but school was arguing with me that it was average, so there's no need here.
And this is where, and again, and this is more my style and understanding the PSW's PSW stands for pattern, strengths, and weaknesses. That as what I do around the country is go around and say that how the school psych and the SLP should be working together, so that I interpret it from a cognitive point of view, they may interpret it from a language point of view. I'm not saying I'm right or the language person is right, but that based on, we could have a discussion between those two lenses that maybe there might be a cognitive issue that is not being seen by the language person. Because they haven't, because those, let's say, Tiffany, there were 3 subtests within that composite, but they're all about expressive language. One may be low, but in general, their expressive language is pretty good. Based on 2 out of 3 were pretty good. I would say his expressive, I would go along with that. I would say his expressive language is fine. But then if I looked at the cognitive issues and I saw that 2 measured, I'm just throwing out words now, 2 measured working memory and the low one measured reasoning skills, let's say, I'd be like, you're missing the reasoning part within that expressive language. Does that make sense, Tiffany?
Yeah, I think it's just right now my own personal battle, I guess, because
I understand. Right.
he has a lot of working memory stuff. He has a lot of different things. And I have my speech people telling me, yes, it's a language disorder. He needs speech. And we'll say no.
But what does that mean in terms of what working memory is and how does that impact some of his language? And usually people talk about working memory and executive functioning kind of hand in hand in so many ways. And it's one part of executive functioning. And that it's going to be lots of compensatory skills that we have to teach him so he knows how to be more efficient at his reading, more efficient at his writing, and more efficient at his math. And that's to kind of teach about how to do, like he should write everything down. That's, but that, and also just as a quick point, I don't know, what grade is he in?
3rd.
3rd grade, okay. Just as a quick point, 8th grade is not harder than 3rd grade.
Okay.
It's age appropriate. Right now, you're a 3rd grader, should not be doing 8th grade work. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That often people say, well, what's going to happen when he gets to 8th grade? Slow down.
Yeah.
We have to work with the here and now and start teaching him, and also teach him how to advocate for himself. That I need to write this down, that it's okay. And that, because I get really worried when it comes to homework, when they say, well, it takes everyone 15 minutes to do homework. For him, it's going to take him a half hour, 40 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
That's not fair. And so I want him to advocate and say, listen, I dig that you think this could take me 15 minutes. That's not happening.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And also to make him feel okay about it, that he worked hard for that half hour to write a note that my kid worked hard for a half hour because of working memory issues. It's hard for him to do this quickly. Does that make sense? Yep. And therefore his grade should not be, his grade shouldn't be lower.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I understand what you said. So that's why I wanted to parse out a little bit where the SLP was coming from. If all of those were like expressive language issues, I believe it. In terms of language stuff, but I'm not, so I don't know what the SLP is looking at in terms of cognition and what else may be going on with your child at that time.
Yeah.
So it's very frustrating, and it's just, it's scary and concerning all the time, but that, sometimes that low number, and I just don't know what the whole test looks like.
Yeah.
Sometimes that low number is not a bad thing per se, if I have a preponderance of other data showing that he's okay. So for example, I've had kids I've assessed where they've done crappy on reading comprehension, but meanwhile they're in honors level English ELA class. I'm like, my test was nonsense then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I need that other data to get a better sense of what's going on. But that it's the goals that would be set would be that for everybody is that, and that's where it gets really into the RTI, MTSS kind of stuff. What's the baseline and how do they come up with the goal? So if it's, let's say it's expressive language for a moment, how many expressive phrases are they having? So maybe it's like 5 phrases that by the end of 10 weeks, they're going to have 25 phrases.
Okay.
That makes more sense rather than he's going to be able to say this 85% of the time. Where, you know, he's going to have 85% success in 2 out of 3 trials.
Yeah.
Right. Every time you see something like that, everyone should go and look at the PLEPs or the present levels of performance and see what is the baseline. Because if your goal is for the kid to do 85% 2 out of 3 trials, shouldn't they have a baseline? And let's say the baseline was 0. There is no way I would allow it to be 85% as the goal. But let's say the baseline was 75% of the time. He's doing it right now. What the hell are you making an 85% goal? It should be at 100%.
Yeah.
But generally, but that's where they kind of confuse you in the meetings, because they say he's going to get help with the SLP, but you look at the goal. I'm sure there's some people on here or anyone who's watching have had the same goals year in, year out. It's never changed because no one ever has a baseline. And that gets scary and frustrating because you see your kid not making success either during the year or at those crazy meetings. Generally, that's what happens.
Yeah,
So
my last,
go ahead,
my
Tiffany.
last meeting, I brought them, I can never say it right, but the reading rope and all the different, and I asked them, okay, we are here for him. What exactly from each of these strands, where is he low? And I brought it to 2 meetings because we had a continuation and nobody could fill that out for me.
Correct.
And
they absolutely cannot.
They cannot.
No. Almost all, I don't know a district that can at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I think you're asking the right questions. And remember that one slide I showed that had like the different ways of assessing those different areas. And all could be done with like a 1-minute measure. And that's where it's, and you're welcome to email me and I could get you, let you know what those measures are.
Okay.
Okay. So absolutely email me and I'll get you those measures. And you say to the school, listen, you need to do a baseline using this measure. And you need to report to me within 2 weeks. It's a 1 or 2 minute measure. And the instructions are 3 sentences long. If they can't manage that, there's something more amiss at your school district than
well, that's a whole other conversation.
Yes, I understand. Right. But understand they just don't know. They're not being malicious. They just don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've come to find out pretty quickly. And he's only in 3rd grade.
Right. And unfortunately, that's around the whole country.
Yeah.
Not just your district. That's not letting the district off the hook. I just want you to understand the craziness is normal, unfortunately.
Okay.
And that's where.
Well, that makes me feel better or worse, but thank you.
Right. I know. Yeah. So it's frustrating all the time.
Here's a scenario then. So I really like that slide that you shared in terms of like the questions of what to ask. So parents come to me, I know all the time asking, I have concerns about my kid. Like, what do I do? My kid's not reading or what? So how would you triage that? Or, or for example, say we've got 3rd grade, parent says child is struggling, tier 1 is Fountas and Pinnell. Report cards look good. Fountas and Pinnell looks good. Where would you go from there?
Right. So there's a couple things that usually happens. One, if they know that Fountas Pinnell is going on, that's magic that a parent knows that. That'll be awesome if a parent knew that. Generally, what they hear is that my kid is in 3rd grade reading at a 1st grade level. That's how I hear it. And I say, oh, that's interesting. So can you explain that? What the hell is a 1st grade level? And they can't. I go, right. No one has told you, as Tiffany pointed out, those different skills. So does he have good phonemic awareness? And I explain what phonemic awareness is, explain those different things. And that I say your kid is not while your kid's in 3rd grade, it does not mean that he's reading at a kindergarten level. That is devastating to a parent. It's awful. And it's mean because it's not true. The kid is a 3rd grader who has language of a 3rd grader. They just need to have access to the text. And so, that's my triage. Usually when sometimes they'll say, my kid can't read. And my first thought is that's untrue. Can he read his name? Great, he could read. What skills can he do and where are those gaps? Much like with the rope, then that's how I triage things with the parent. I don't use any highfalutin language. I kind of get at those different skills, and then sometimes they still don't know, and that's okay. And the same thing when a parent tells me, oh, we read together every night. I go, no, you don't. Your kid memorizes the passage, which is a really important thing to know about the kid, but good God, they ain't reading any of the words. Right? So I find out about that. What do you mean you read every night to your kid? Does this kid can you give different books? Do you have decodable books? What type of books do you have? Kind of be able to provide for that. So that's which they won't know what a decodable book is, and then I'll provide them with a couple of decodable books and show them how to kind of teach the reading around that during those very precious moments when you're reading with your child at night. And it can be exciting, and the kid likes certain things because of the pretty colors. You got to use voices, you got to use colors, you got to use all that kind of stuff to kind of get the kids involved. I don't know, does that make sense, Tina?
Yeah, I think that helps. I think thank you for sharing your observations in terms of assessments being overused and
Right.
all of that. I think that there is a sense of, at least with some folks that I talk to, a sense of mistrust of the school's typical assessments, be it Fontes and Pinnell benchmarks or iReady or things like that. So what are ways, if we can't,
makes sense.
Right. So what else can we do to get good measurements?
Yeah.
That aren't just full assessments.
Correct. So that you could definitely ask for the fluency measures to happen, the curriculum-based measurements or CBMs, so that you'll be asking for reading fluency or initial sound fluency measures. So remember that one slide where I said if the kid has poor comprehension, then I'm going to look at their oral reading fluency. If they're really crappy fluency, then I'm going to look at their word recognition. In terms of looking at their word recognition, I would do a word recognition fluency measure. All those are available. Acadians is a great place to start to find those measures. And that you would say, I appreciate you doing Fontes Pinnell. Here's the data that needs to be collected on top of that. And they're going to say, well, we have fluency under Fontes Pinnell. I go, congratulations to you. Here's the other piece of data that I want. Period. I don't need to battle anything else out of that. It's a reasonable request to say that you need to do this 1-minute measure once a week. I think that's reasonable. Would that seem reasonable? 1 minute, takes about 2 minutes out of your way. Go do that and just report that data back to me. And I will give you all the probes. All the probes are available. So I'll give the probes, and then that's the data that I want on top of things. And I can do that at the meeting, at the IP meeting. Thank you. Yes, please bring the Fontes Pinnell data with you. At the next meeting, I also want to know the specific skills that letter D is different than the letter C. And I want specific information. It's fair. You're not being unreasonable with this. Then please, just let me know, because it's important. I appreciate it that my kid moved from C to D. That's terrific. So what was the specific skill that my kid has improved upon? And if you can't give me that information, then we have to figure out other ways of getting that information. And thank you for all the work you've been doing with the kid. But I really would like to know those skills. I understand we have difference of opinion about what reading is, but this is going to be a really important reading to kind of do. Right, D book is easier than C, right. And so then I said, that's wonderful. So what makes it easier? And that they can't answer that. Well, it's easier words. Well, that makes no sense. And so it's trying to use their lack of knowledge, just trying to encourage them to kind of get other data to confirm or reject their hypothesis that things are getting better.
Can I ask you just to clarify? Sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
When you were showing the different IQs and reading abilities, you said the gifted LD shouldn't get help because they're part of the herd. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah. If your reading performance is dead on average, you're a fine reader. Let's say all of your cognitive abilities are just off the charts. It doesn't mean that your comprehension could go only so far, but your reading skills are fine. You are. If I didn't look at the cognitive abilities and you just saw reading was dead on average, you wouldn't bat an eye. Does that make sense? The kid is good at reading. If that reading performance was below the normal limits and his cognitive abilities were well above the normal limits, that's different. That is a gifted LD type of kid. But if my reading performance is like within the average range, then you will have average reading skills and you will be okay in school.
So is it not the same as when you were saying that they get frustrated, like if they have the poor processing speed, right? And they have the ability. Isn't it similar to that they know that they can read or they can comprehend things at a higher level than what they're currently at, the disconnect?
No, and generally that's not going to happen, because what happens is that, because let's say because everything is super awesome. Let's even say their processing speed. You only could go so fast in how you read. You can't read super fast. That is not helping you comprehend. You have to read at an appropriate rate with the proper tone and affect. And so you will be able to comprehend because you have access to all the text. You understand all the text. And so there's no frustration around it because everything you're doing is fine. Now, some of those kids are just like, I'm bored with this, right? This information is not really doing it for me. That is not because of the gifted LD kind of scenario. That's a kid who, may need to read The Hobbit in first grade, but they'll still be average at the end of the day.
And how does that correlate with their writing ability? Because the reading and writing were tested on the same sequence.
Yeah, and the writing could be average as well. But now trying to measure writing has been real hard to do. That those numbers are always dicey at best. So when I do writing, I look at writing fluency. Writing fluency, what I do is I count every word, every connecting word. So if they write Jack and Jill went up the hill, that's semantically correct, spelled correctly. Jack to and would count as a point, and to Jill would count as a point. Jack and Jill went, Jill to went would count as a point. Because the more fluent you are at writing, most likely the more you can write. Okay? But I would also use a rubric to see about the depth of the kid's writing. And what are they writing about? Can they make a paragraph correctly? But also about the content, I would use a rubric around that. And there are some good rubrics out there for that. So I would look at their fluency and I would look at their content through the rubric. And usually I could do that. And that's another thing where I would do as a whole class. I would do a story starter with the whole class and say, okay, so write about your favorite holiday. Everyone has 2 minutes to think about what they want to write. Then you're going to have 7 minutes to write whatever you want to write. They take the 7 minutes, they all write whatever they want to write. I count up how many words each kid wrote. And then I have my population curve to see which kids are my bottom 20% kids. Those kids I'm really going to work with. I could do the same, math fluency, I could do the same thing. But at least I get a sense of that kid is writing. Now, if the kid has spelling issues because he's dyslexic, their writing fluencies could be miserable. Does that make sense? So now their writing is bad. Let's say that your kid writes 20 words in the 7 minutes, whereas everyone else writes 200 words in the 7 minutes. Let's say that happens. There are norms to say that if I teach this, if I do a good intervention with this kid, he's going to improve by about 1 word per week to close the gap. That's the information I want. Don't tell me a kid is struggling. Don't tell me a kid is making progress. Those words are verboten for me. If you tell me most kids are reading 200 words, my kid is reading 20, I get it, he's struggling. But let's say that most kids improve by, I'm just throwing out crazy numbers, 0.3 words per week, but my kid's improving by 1.5 words per week. At the end of 10 weeks, the gap is closed, but my kid's still way behind everybody else. But don't you dare say my kid is struggling. Because if I say he was struggling at the beginning and struggling at the end, how is that motivational? I've worked my tail off to close the gap. And now you're saying I'm still struggling? That's not fair. And so, and it's the same, and I also say that for the teacher, because the teacher worked hard for the kid to get that kid moving in the right direction. Right? If I have a kid who's standing up 100 times a day, and I meet with the teacher, I think I said this before, and the teacher, what does the teacher want? The teacher wants that kid standing up 0 times, right? I go, great, in 3 weeks' time, we'll have them standing up 0 times. Is that possible? Absolutely not. I go, right, so let's get rid of that fantasy. How about if we do this one little thing for 5 minutes, he'll be standing up 80 times. Great, 3 weeks' time, he's standing up 85 times. Okay, is that better than 100? Yes. Is the intervention working? Yes. But if I didn't have any quantifiable information, the 85 would feel like a 100. And they would say the intervention is not working because they didn't have the data. So there are norms to things like writing, there are norms for reading, there are norms for math. To say if my kid is starting here, then after about 18 weeks, they should be here. That's the information that generally does not happen at those meetings. They just say 85% of the time, 2 out of 3 times, and we're going to look at it twice. Generally, that's what the IEPs look like. That's where I have no patience. I'm like, show me the PLEPs. What's the baseline? Here's the normative. And if you, again, if you go to Acadians or Dibbles, so if you go to Dibbles, D-I-B-E-L-S, they'll give you what the rate of improvement should be. So you're armed with that information. And again, you could ask for politely that each week, you know, here's the writing, because if your kid is so far behind, I presume they're getting AIS or special ed, wherever it might be, meaning that there are maybe 3 to 5 kids at the same time within that 40-minute session. So that's 200 minutes over the week. I would like you to spend 5 minutes and collect this data. That's a reasonable request. Thank you very much. Thank you for working hard with my kid. This data is going to help me out and help this meeting out. So when you go back to the distrust is in part because nobody knows what any of the data means. So they give you really bad explanations. They don't understand what standard score is. They don't understand percentiles. They don't understand baseline and goal. And they really don't understand what is reading, what is writing, what is math. And they don't understand what font disciplinel does in the first place. So they hem and haw, all in hopes that you say, we'll give them special ed, which means extra help, and that you'll leave them alone after that. Because that's all, in general, what I understand parents want the school to do, is get my kid extra help. So I know I covered a lot with that statement, Tina, but I think that's generally the frustration I hear a lot in your meetings, where it's like, well, what testing should I get done? What should happen here? Right? Or they just kind of, that's why I said it's like people just kind of throw numbers out and say that was a low number. Well, what the hell does that mean? So there are ways to kind of, so what I'll do usually after I do an assessment, I'll meet with the parent, I'll explain all those different cognitive areas. And I'll use stuff like file cabinet, Jeopardy, because I'm not going to be at every meeting after that. I want them to be able to say, this is what the assessment is about. And so when I was at an IEP meeting, I would say, what are you looking at me for? She knows everything. And there goes the parent saying, he has really good working memory, really good at doing processing speed, but when it comes to his reasoning skills, it's not so good. I go, right. It's much more powerful and it scares the crap out of everyone else. So it's one of those things, you know, it's the same thing where I'll go into, if I do an independent evaluation, I'll go into the IP meeting. I go, okay, does everyone agree that Johnny's a good boy? Does everyone agree that Johnny works hard? Everyone agree? Good. Mom, dad, do you agree? Yes. Everyone's on the same page? Good. We are not hearing that. Tell me what his baseline is, and let's go to the goals, because we have 20 minutes and I don't want 20 minutes of nonsense. That's what it is, I find. I don't know if that's generally the gist or what people find. Amy, yes, I see you're nodding. I don't know if that happens or right.
Yes.
I wasn't even at your meeting and I knew what happened. Kind of thing. It's very bizarre. Tiffany, you said the same thing, yes?
Yeah, they waste a lot of time telling me how wonderful he is, which I know.
Right.
That's what we're there for.
Right. So it's not being rude. They don't know what to do with themselves after that, but you could, if you want to write a letter saying that, listen, I appreciate everyone's work and everyone, and we all are, and I appreciate how much you care about my child, and I appreciate all the fond notes that you give about my child. Well, I'm asking because I know that we only have 20 minutes. If you could move past that and just get right to the goals, to the base, to the PLEPs and to the goals. So they'll still
before
do
we even get
their
to
nonsense.
before we get to IEPs,
Yeah.
if we're not even at that stage yet, you're saying CBMs, request those, requestables, and if those don't exist in your district, keep asking, keep asking, keep asking.
But it's not just asking, you have to provide them with the resource. You have to say that here is where this manual will explain how to do the CBM. And so if you go to Acadience, you give them the Acadience link, and that you say that you're happy to meet with the teacher, and both of you kind of read it over and kind of figure out what to do. I'll take out that time to do that with you. There are also, if you go to YouTube, there are lots of videos of somebody doing, if you go to University of Oregon and you type in, you know, if you type in YouTube, like University of Oregon CBMs, they'll show you how to do a CBM. So, you know, can you watch the video? And just to know that the data should go up and down. Data does not go linear. For a whole host of reasons I'm not going to get into, because I know it's 9:25 and I apologize for taking up so much of your time, and I thank you guys for staying on, for God's sake. I don't know why you're listening to me at this late at night, but that, you know, it should be like, let's say you have like 24 words and it goes like 26 words, then it'll go to like 17 words, then it'll go to like 28 words, 29 words, 20 words, 30 words. The data should go up and down, but the slope, the line that goes through all those data points, should be going up at a certain rate. I'll do 30 seconds on what that rate should be. Okay. Let's say that there are benchmarks outside of what your fonts. I'm not talking about Fontes and Pinnell benchmarks. Okay, so benchmark is a very important word that should be used. If you have a bad tool, it's a crappy benchmark. Benchmarks are appropriate. Fontes and Pinnell is not. But that if I have an oral reading fluency benchmark of, I'm just throwing out numbers, of 100 in the fall, that means how many words they're able to read per minute. So let's say it's 100. And that after 18 weeks, which brings me to the winter, it's 120 words. Does that make sense? You have to improve, like, say it's third grade. 20 words, 120 words in the winter, 100 words in the fall. If I subtract 120 from 100, that's 20. If I divide that by 18, that's somewhere around like 1.1 word per week. Does that make sense as a rate of improvement? My kid is reading 50 words a minute, where the benchmark is 100. Does that follow? I'm at 50. I need that kid to be at 120. 120 minus 50 is 70. 70 divided by 18 might be like 5 words per week. That's way out of whack. There's no way anyone's going to get that. People thought, does that make sense what I just said? Just in terms of, right? Because I want them to close the gap all the way, yes? Sometimes what I do is I double what that benchmark goal would be, that rate of improvement. Remember we talked about the 100 minus 120, so it's a 1.1. I'll double that. So that's 2.2 words. Is that fair? So my kid is starting at 50 words. Does that make sense? My kid's 50, well below the 100. He should improve by 2.2 words per week with the good intervention. After 10 weeks, I'm just keeping that easy, that's about 22 words. He started at 50, 22 words, be 72 words. Does that follow? So the goal would be 72 words. Mind you, the other kids are after those 10 weeks are about 110. Have I closed the gap? Because before I started at 100 and then another one was at 50, so it's 50 words. Now most kids are at 110, but my kid's at 72. My kid is healing. So yes, he's still below his peers, but he's definitely closing the gap. That, as a parent, makes me feel much better about whatever the school is doing. And by the way, the school might be doing Fontes Pinnell, and the kid can actually improve by like that. Even though they're not doing what they should be doing, but some kids are able to pick up reading even through Fontes Pinnell. But at least you see the gap. That if someone told me that, well, he moved from a B to a C, I'd have no clue what the hell that means. But that number helps me feel better about whatever's going on in the school. So that's where progress monitoring comes in. So let's go back to your original point, Tina, of just so a parent comes in and says, my kid is struggling in reading. I go, I have no clue what you mean by that. Ultimately, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, what's the baseline? What's the reality? But then the parent's not going to know that information. Then I start to break down what all the different parts of reading are. The parent has some sense of that. And then I'm like, okay, so here's some of the measurements that you want to try to do. Thank you guys for the nice words. I appreciate it. And I'm sorry again, I know it's 9:30 and you guys have been very kind and generous with your time. So everything I'm saying, by the way, is much easier said than done. Because schools are defensive, because ultimately you have to show, they have to acknowledge they don't understand reading, writing, or math. And that's a scary proposition for them. They are appropriately defensive because it means that, does everyone in that room want to know everything about reading, writing, and math? Yes. But you're kind of showing them they just don't know what that is. And that is uncomfortable. So any way that I can make it a little bit easier to kind of bridge that gap, because I dig the lack of trust, but I need to know the information so that I can make them more trustworthy by providing them with the information. If that makes sense. It's so much easier said than done. It's terrible. Feel bad for all the parents.
I think we're getting there. Like you said, there's a lot of media coverage, there's articles, like I feel like there's some bright spots and good things that are happening, but maybe my grandchildren will have a different experience.
So good. So hopefully that was helpful, and just kind of talk about numbers real quick. And I know I blew by that, but I'm happy to show you any of the goals or anything like that. And I look forward to coming to future meetings and this stuff. So
thank you so much. No, totally, definitely appreciate it. Thank you so